Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the government shutdown now in a record 40th day, with 40 major airports cutting flights and cancelling reservations, as 13,000 air traffic controllers and 55,000 TSA agents work without pay. We will assess air safety and what strategy Trump might be employing as his transportation secretary raises the alarm, with the possible purpose of putting political pressure on the Democrats. Joining us is Jeff Wise, a science journalist specializing in aviation and psychology, a licensed pilot of gliders and light aircraft. He has served as an on-camera aviation analyst on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, and his articles have appeared in the New York Magazine, the New York Times, Time, Business Week, Esquire, and many others. He is the author of The Taking of MH370 and the host of the podcast Finding MH370, and he has an article at New York Magazine we will discuss, Get Ready for an Air Travel Meltdown. Then, sitting next to Hungary's kleptocratic dictator Orban, who gerrymandered himself into permanent power with 45% of the vote capturing 91% of the parliament, on Friday, Trump called on Senate Republicans to kill the filibuster, announcing, quote, "If we do it, we will never lose the midterms and we'll never lose a general election." Joining us to discuss how Trump plans to rig the next election is David Graham, a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics and national affairs. He won the Turner Prize for Excellence in National Political Reporting for his coverage of the 2020 presidential election, and his new book is The Project: How Project 2025 is Reshaping America. His latest article at The Atlantic is The Anti-MAGA Majority Reemerges, and his recent article, Donald Trump's Plan to Subvert the Midterms, is already underway, which has gained national attention and has been widely circulated. Then finally, Background Briefing's Gen Z reporter Sasha Linden Cohen will do a follow-up on the youth-driven Mamdani victory for mayor of New York and speak with J.W. Mason, a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and a professor of economics at John Jay College of the City University of New York, where his research focuses on macroeconomics, finance, economic history, and the history of economic thought and international finance and trade. He was previously the policy director for the New York State Working Families Party, and Sasha will discuss his recent article at Dissent magazine, What Can Zoran Accomplish? And before we begin with our tax dollars paying for the bombing of innocents abroad and racist thuggery at home, as families are ripped apart and neighbors disappeared from our streets, shops, and schools, we find ourselves at a moral moment when America's better angels have to be mobilized against a cruel and corrupt regime enabled by political cowardice and judicial blindness. The only way to save our democracy from its current descent into fascism is a massive mobilization of people power against a plutocratic-funded 2026 Trump campaign of voter suppression and intimidation by masked government thugs. As Trump cowers the owners of the press and defunds public broadcasting, Background Briefing needs your support to keep providing a reality-based daily briefing that exposes the regime's malevolent machinations to protect and defend our constitutional rights and freedom of speech and assembly. We ask you to make a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at our foundation, publictruthmedia.org, and thank you for defending the home of the brave and the land of the free. And joining us now, Jeff Wise, a science journalist specializing in aviation and psychology, a licensed pilot of gliders and light airplanes. He has served as an on-camera aviation analyst on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, and his articles have appeared in the New York Magazine, the New York Times, Time, Business Week, Esquire, and many others. And he's the author of The Taking of MH370 and is the host of the podcast Finding MH370. And he has an article at New York Magazine, Get Ready for an Air Travel Meltdown. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jeff Wise.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And we're in our record-long government shutdown, 40 days into it. And that has resulted in shutdowns at 40 major airports in the country. And these shutdowns at these major airports also involve, of course, 13,000 air traffic controllers and 50,000 TSA agents who are working without pay. Already over 3 million air travelers have been hit with the flight delays and cancellations. And in 2 weeks' time, we'll have the busiest time of all, which is Thanksgiving for air travel. So, in the broader sense, Jeff, is this situation an accident waiting to happen?
In terms of air safety, I am a little bit less concerned about that. I mean, I think that the FAA has been pretty proactive in terms of reducing load on the system in order that their air traffic controllers aren't overloaded. It's certainly a bad situation in a lot of different ways. It certainly is threatening to cause chaos, as you mentioned, in the Thanksgiving travel season. But even before that, for the moment, I think that people are getting through. In my recent New York Magazine piece, I quoted an expert saying that, you should definitely get to the airport early, especially if there are delays caused by TSA agent shortages. The system is holding up for now, but it's certainly not heading in the right direction.
But apparently, there have been three close calls since the government shutdown began. And one of those was on Halloween, October the 31st, here in Los Angeles, an American Airlines Flight 4 to New York and an Italian airliner almost collided. They took off on parallel runways, and then the Italian plane moved dangerously close to the American Airlines flight, causing the air traffic controllers to say, American 4, just stop your climb. And then to the Italian plane, the air traffic controller says 621 heavy. You should have been runway heading there. Is this a reason you turned to the south? So apparently that was a pretty bad close call, and there's a lot of people aboard both of those planes.
Right, but I don't know if it's clear that that incident was a result of a shortage in the tower. I mean, basically, a pilot did something wrong. The controller told them, "Hey, don't do that wrong thing," and thereby averting disaster. That's pretty normal. That's how the system is supposed to work. I
But
don't know the details of that particular
right,
incident. It may be that near misses and other potentially dangerous situations are in the increase. I just don't have the data
right.
at that right now.
Well, the Transportation Secretary, though, Sean Duffy, has said on Friday that we've seen more incursions on tarmacs throughout the country, and we've had more complaints from pilots about stress from air traffic controllers, and more complaints about the lack of responsiveness from controllers. So that's not good.
It's very interesting to me that Sean Duffy, the Secretary of Transportation, is actually one of the most alarmist voices in the conversation right now. He seems to be talking up the looming failures of the system, talking up the shortages in the towers and so forth. I'm not exactly sure. I don't know if he feels like he wants to protect his purview by making sure that there's a lot of alarm out there. It might be that there's a certain amount of political maneuvering going on here. The Air Current, which is an excellent online aviation source of news, reported that they talked to a number of airline CEOs and heard that a lot of the airlines, they're being forced to reduce capacity, as you mentioned in your intro. That reduction capacity isn't a direct result of a shortage of air traffic controllers. It's the direct cause is that the Department of Transportation, with very little notice, just sort of dropped this on the airlines. Like Wednesday, they're like, "You guys have to reduce your capacity by Friday," and this was kind of a nightmare scenario for the airlines. They didn't see that there was a strong safety need for it. They wondered if there was like a political aspect to it. Maybe Sean Duffy, who was appointed by Donald Trump, wanted to try to, accelerate the perceived pain on the part of the public, and make it seem like the system's going to collapse. You try to light a fire under the Democrats, basically. The whole thing doesn't quite make any sense, but it's unusual, not kind of playing out how it would normally do in a normal kind of government situation.
Well, clearly, this is not a normal government, but
No.
it's also a government run by a so-called strongman who has his underlings essentially as lackeys, and they're mostly cast because of what they look like on television. And that
Yeah.
also applies to Sean Duffy, having had a past in as a television actor. So I think it's been driven by Trump. I mean, I think Trump on not just on the airline issue is trying to create panic to force the hand of the Democrats, but he's also doing it with food stamps or with SNAP. I mean, here he is going to the Supreme Court demanding that they not feed 1 in 8 Americans. What other explanation is there for that? Apart from cruelty, of course.
I think it might there's a sort of a grab bag of possible solutions that would seem to present themselves. One is he legitimately holds this kind of sincere political belief that any government assistance for the needy is philosophically wrong. We need to live in a kind of survival of the fittest type environment. So he really wants to see people to go hungry. Maybe it'll motivate them to work for cheaper or something, and help the bottom line for corporations. I mean, he seems to be suffering from some kind of mental degeneration. I mean, he's repeatedly bragging about how well he does on these, what he seems to think are some sort of mental mastery tests. They're actually Alzheimer's or dementia tests. And so the fact that he doesn't really realize what a dementia test is should be concerning. I mean, we had a major, political crisis erupt during the 2024 elections because Joe Biden was deemed by some people to be mentally not worthy. We also survived the Ronald Reagan in his second term was battling with progressive Alzheimer's, which really did not get out at the time. So I think there's a lot of really urgent questions to be asked about what exactly is going on with this guy's brain.
And the situation now, of course, is dire in terms of people working for nothing. And that's got to be hard on 50,000 TSA workers and 13,000 air traffic controllers.
There's supposed to be 13,000 air
Yes,
traffic controllers.
it
It's
says so.
actually below 11,000 as I understand it.
Right.
So there is a legitimate shortage of controllers. It's a problem that's been lingering for a long time and has gotten progressively worse, both under Biden and under Trump. It's hard. These air traffic controllers are highly trained people who work under high pressure situations, and the stakes are, of course, absolutely enormous. And so these people are carefully selected. There's a very high dropout rate. Not everyone who tries gets in because you want to make sure that you have the best of the best. TSA agents, it's a little bit easier. Well, let me put it this way. It's a lot easier to become a TSA agent. It takes less training. You don't get paid as much. And so when the government says to these people, you have to work, you are ethically and morally obliged to work, even though we're not going to pay you. I think that the sort of group of people who are air traffic controllers respond with a sort of higher, sense of we must do as we are instructed to do. I think TSA agents are more likely to say, "Screw you, buddy. I'm not coming in." So I think that the security lines have suffered more than the air traffic control capacity.
But 40 days in, so asking a lot for people to go unpaid.
Yeah, we used to have a system of unpaid labor in this country. It was called slavery. We abolished it
God.
at some expense. But I don't know. I guess it's back. I think there are some people maybe who just think that slavery would be good common sense for business.
Right, but when you talk about the numbers of air traffic controllers, Doge early on in this second Trump term eviscerated the FAA, didn't they? Didn't they fire a whole bunch of air traffic controllers? And then shortly thereafter, there was a collision at Reagan International in Washington, D.C.
The midair collision at Reagan was just a few days after the start of the Trump administration. I don't think you can really pin that one on the Trump administration, just because it happened so quickly after. The sort of buzzsaw that was Doge did affect some FAA employees at first. I think they immediately backed away from that. Aviation is kind of a sacred cow in American politics. Everyone likes to fly, especially politicians, and you don't want nobody wants to get on a plane and have a lingering doubt in the back of their mind. So it has been spared, I think, the worst.
But a lot of listeners have written into me saying, that we live in an era of the rule of oligarchs, and many of Trump's cabinet people are billionaires, and and his family have become billionaires since he became president in the last 9 months. So, is there anything to that suspicion that these people don't care about the traveling public? because they all fly private. And of course, Trump's made a big deal out of having his own plane, and now the Qataris have given him a $400 million jumbo jet. So, is there anything to that? Because I would think that even private aviation is subject to FAA control and therefore deficiency.
I think it's very dangerous for the Trump administration to pin like logic to what they do. To say, oh, he's doing this because he wants to do that. Because you sort of imagine, well, if I was a rational being, I would do this. Well, he wants to put this tariff on China because, he wants to encourage the building of factories in the United States. It's an understandable impulse that we have, but this person is not operating with any kind of clear sense of direction or purpose. He's constantly just imposing things like some idea will pop into his head and he'll tweet it out, and all of a sudden it has the force of law with no review, no consideration. It's not clear I mean, he's taking away SNAP benefits from his own, presumably his own constituency. He's undermining farmers, cattle raisers, cattle farmers, ranchers, I guess is the word. Um, and it's like it's almost like chaos is the point. And you might well ask yourself, well, why would someone want to, um, you know, create chaos in his own country? And I think it's worth considering the possibility that this is not in any sense a normal presidency.
But is there anything to the fact that seems to have a thing about aircraft and having big private jets, and now he's had his private jet, and that seems to be a status symbol for him, and now the Qataris have lavished him with this huge jumbo jet. Does that mean though that he knows a little bit about aviation, and you think that he'd be a little more sensitive to aviation safety as a result?
I think that the president and indeed much of the United States suffers from what I call mashed potato brains, which is a complete inability to have a realistic model of how the world works, or to be interested in how the world works, or have the mental faculty to understand how the world works. And so if you look at how voters, like what motivates voters to vote, you hear their rationale. They're largely motivated by things that are made up or imaginary or just plain wrong. Um, and I think Trump, for instance, he has really severe mashed potato brains. He was at right after the DCA crash, actually the Reagan crash. He was going on and on and on about how, like, helicopters can go up, they can go sideways, they can go down, all this. And he was saying that he thought that the American air traffic control system was bad, and because of that, he has his own like European-made air traffic control system in his plane. That statement does not make any sense. And I don't know what model of things there is in his brain that he thinks how he thinks the air system works, but he is profoundly confused. And so when you ask me like what is motivating him, I don't think you can really talk about motivation in the way that a normal, informed, mentally competent, political, like ethical person would form a decision.
Well, Jeff, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I thank you very much for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And again, I'll be speaking with Jeff Wise, who's a science journalist specializing in aviation and psychology, a licensed pilot of gliders and light airplanes. He has served as an on-camera aviation analyst on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, and his articles have appeared in New York Magazine, the New York Times, Time, Business Week, Esquire, and many others. And he's the author of The Taking of MH370, and he's the host of the podcast Finding MH370. And he has an article at New York Magazine, Get Ready for an Air Travel Meltdown. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking at how Trump will rig the next election, since he's announced that we will never lose the midterms and we will never lose a general election.
So kiss me and smile for me. Tell me that you'll wait for me. Hold me like you'll never let me go. 'Cause I'm leaving on a jet plane. Don't know when I'll be back again.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, David Graham, a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics and national affairs. He won the Toner Prize for Excellence in National Political Reporting for his coverage of the 2020 presidential election. And before joining The Atlantic, he reported for Newsweek, The Daily Beast, The Wall Street Journal, and The National. His new book is The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America. And his latest article at The Atlantic is The Anti-MAGA Majority Reemerges. And his recent article, which was got a lot of national attention and was circulated widely, is Donald Trump's plan to subvert the midterms is already underway. Welcome to Background Briefing, David Graham.
Always good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us, David. And on Friday in the Oval Office, Donald Trump welcomed Orban, the Hungarian dictator, who he said in his usual way, I like and respect him. He's a great leader. He says that about Erdogan and all these other kleptocratic thugs. They're widely respected, which of course is the opposite is true. But he took the opportunity to turn to the press and say, the Senate's got to get rid of the filibuster. And then he went on to say, quote, if we do it, we will never lose the midterms and we will never lose a general election. So that strikes me as telling the quiet part out loud.
That's right. He does this thing where he says things that can be interpreted, if you're really willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, as simply political messaging, but seem to be giving a message pretty clearly about what he wants to do. And if we look at the way he has exerted power and abused power, I think, the simplest meaning is probably the best one to read.
Well, the role of Orban with Trump and the Republicans is pretty deep. I mean, he's been a bagman for Putin and Xi, visiting Mar-a-Lago in between Trump's first and second term. I mean, sitting there talking about getting rid of the filibuster was pretty rich, given that Orban has quickly gerrymandered into a position where he was sort of an immovable object. And him and his family have enriched themselves enormously off EU subsidies. But when he took over, he rigged the elections to the extent that his party, Fidesz, got 45% of the vote, but 91% of the seats in parliament. So there he is sitting next to Trump, and you can't help feeling this is kind of a role model, right? I mean, this guy's really, and he also, through his Danube Foundation, he helped finance Project 2025. So it leads me to think, David, that there's more than Trump on the Republican side that would be happy with a one-party government like they have in Turkey, Hungary, and in Putin's Russia.
Yeah, I think that Orban is such an important model for the MAGA right. And, we've seen major figures on the right, people like Tucker Carlson, going to Hungary and talking about what a paradise it is, him speaking at major conservative gatherings. And I think when you think about interference in elections or sort of tilting elections, Orban is a really important model there too. And he's, what political scientists call a competitive authoritarian, where he has, substantial control. There is an opposition party. There is ostensibly independent media, but they're so disadvantaged that they have a really hard time actually ever winning in elections. So you tilt the media, you tilt the cultural landscape, you tilt elections, and you do things like gerrymandering so that you can win even with a minority of the vote. And we see Trump doing all of those things. We see him bullying major media organizations, ABC, CBS. We see him intimidating the opposition by doing things like investigating or arresting them. We see him pushing gerrymandering. And I think a lot of this will just continue and maybe even only escalate as we get closer to the midterms.
But given how deeply researched your article is, Donald Trump's plan to subvert the midterms is already underway. What's your opinion, David, on the percentage of Republicans that would be happy, both legislators and voters, would be happy with a one-party system?
I think if you look at Republican elected officials, they have shown throughout the Trump era that they are willing to abandon most any principle in order to win re-election. That's how they became part of the Trump coalition, and we've seen them do that over and over. So I think there's not a lot of question about them. I think with voters, it's an interesting question and it's very hard to tell. On the one hand, we think of democracy as being hardwired into Americans, but we see really anti-democratic attitudes within Republican voters, whether that's disapproval of criticism of Trump, disapproval of the press, embrace of political violence. So I think what we can say for sure is there is a substantial portion of the Republican electorate that would be okay with a one-party state.
Well, in terms of getting rid of the filibuster, it's pretty close in the Senate because the Senate village idiot Tommy Tuberville, he wants to go along with Trump. So does Senator Banks and Senator Marshall. On the other side, those that are against getting rid of the filibuster, you have Tom Tillis, Mitch McConnell, Ted Cruz, and Lisa Murkowski. So it's pretty close, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, if anything, the filibuster is a curious case where I've been surprised to see Republicans resisting it all. And I think one reason you see those folks, McConnell, Tillis, opposing it is it's not just that they are sort of in the Trump skeptical wing of Republican Senate, but they're also ones who have been in the minority before, and they're willing to sacrifice a lot of political principles, but they don't want to be in a position where they are in the Senate majority and they don't have the power of the filibuster. So I think it's an interesting break, and I'm curious to see whether they can hold that up or if, as Trump continues to push this, they start to lose their heart.
So when I mentioned the Oval Office meeting with Orban on Friday, Trump said the quiet part out loud. Back in September of last year in Palm Beach at the Turning Point USA rally, Trump said, quote, "Christians, get out the vote. Just this time. You don't have to do it anymore. 4 more years. You know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. We'll have it fixed so good, you're not going to have to vote." So how, I mean, surely we should take that seriously. I don't find that particularly ambiguous.
No, I don't know how else to read it. I mean, he's telling you exactly. He's saying fixed. He's saying you don't have to vote. Only reason you wouldn't have to vote is that there's not a competitive election. I'm not sure what else we're meant to take from that. But he writes these things off as a joke, and some people are willing to go along with that claim that it's a joke. I don't know what the joke would be.
Right. Well, he hasn't done anything about the drubbing they took on Tuesday. And he's basically, I think the reason he hasn't done anything is that he said, I wasn't on the ballot. But as your article, Donald Trump's plan to subvert the midterms is already underway, points out that, the president doesn't have a lot of control over elections since they are state matters. And that goes right back to the founders, the 13 colonies. That was their first demand to join the Union, was to be able to have their own elections. And it's a system that we have in this country, which always mystified me, having worked in the UK and Europe and Australia and other places. It's so easily gamed. And both sides have been gaming it forever. Is that a part of why we have such a wonky, easily manipulated system?
I think it does cut. Cuts both ways in this case. It is just wildly inconsistent, and every time I write about American elections, I get messages from readers in other countries who are just so flabbergasted by why the system works this way. And it's prone to, you have varying standards, you have varying qualities and diligence of the election officials at the local level. And it's interesting, as I was working on this article, I talked to Rick Hassan, who's a professor at UCLA, and he said, I've always believed we should have a national election system. But in the last few years, I think, our country isn't ready for that. And in fact, in the Trump era, having this kind of diffuse system is a defense. It makes it very hard. And so we see Trump claiming he can do things about elections, claiming powers he doesn't have. And, in this case, the fact that he doesn't have those powers, I think, is one thing that might help to keep the system relatively safe.
But your article starts out with a scenario that is chillingly realistic. And let's walk through that, the possibility that on election night or election day, there'll be a couple of districts in Maricopa County, Arizona, that haven't been called. ICE agents and National Guardsmen will have already been deployed there. to find out whether there are so-called illegal immigrants voting. And as the scenario goes on, you point out that Trump's already got the people in place to make this mountain out of a molehill and provide the excuse to even bring about the Insurrection Act with Pam Bondi and Kash Patel putting out disinformation. So it's not that far-fetched, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's not either. And I'd say it rattled me to work on this. And I think one thing that has been to Trump's benefit is his willingness to do things that he and his advisors know are likely not illegal, but they also know they can move fast, or likely not legal, but he knows that they can move fast, and it takes a long time for the system to catch up for them. Even if courts are willing to stop Trump, it doesn't happen immediately, as we've seen in instances, for example, with deportations. And so they're just willing to charge ahead and say they have power and dare someone to stop them. And often someone doesn't.
Well, I think that gets to the basis of Trump's success. Remember, he said when he was running back in 2015, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and not lose a vote. He is a criminal, thinks like a criminal, and criminals have an advantage over law-abiding citizens because they push the envelope and do stuff that you would never expect and never do. So, does that explain his advantage, why he breaks norms and gets away with so much?
I think it does. And, you see people who want to defend the system trying to keep up with that and trying to plan ahead. But it's hard to plan ahead because there's so many possibilities. And simply looking at what is allowed doesn't really get you there. You have to think more broadly.
So if he were to get rid of the filibuster, and his first priority, and he said it himself, is to change the election rules. And as he said in front of Orban, we'll never lose an election again. The first thing he wants to do is get rid of mail-in voting. He wants to get rid of early voting and insist on same-day voting. Can you walk us through some of what he's really already said he wants to do?
Yeah, so he said he wants to make sure that everyone has to vote by election day. He would prefer everyone vote on election day without mail-in voting. He wants to ban mail-in voting. And remember him, meeting with Putin and coming back from that, encouraged by Putin to do that. He wants to ensure that ballots that are postmarked by election day but arrive later aren't counted. He has argued in some cases for hand counting of ballots, which is much slower and prone to error than machine counting. He has tried to direct federal authorities to decertify the voting machines, basically every voting machine that is in use in this country, because the conditions he has laid out don't match any existing voting machine on the market. All of these things to try to force state election authorities to operate on rules that he thinks will be more beneficial to him.
But the scary possibility is foreign interference because he got rid of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, which is a part of DHS. It was run by Chris Krebs, who he's now targeted for arrest or for investigation by the Department of Justice, along with Miles Taylor. And he declared that the 2020 elections were clean and free and fair. And I think he said something along the lines that it was the most accurate election we've ever had. But now that he's Trump and Doge and company have slashed the CISA workforce, and they're basically like a lot of government agencies, not on top of which they're shut down in any case, they're pretty defunct. That means that foreign and domestic hackers could get involved. And even going back to the last election, 2024, I've talked to a lot of people in Pennsylvania, and they think that something happened at the last minute because the Democrats were ahead, and suddenly, in the last hours or so, they suddenly lost the Senate and the state. So, is there a potential here, given the vacuum that Trump has created? Or another way to put it is, has he deliberately created this vulnerability in order for it to be exploited?
It seems like he is willing to do that. I mean, he has a grudge against CISA simply because in 2020 they did say that the election was fair. He's reduced these things, and you're right. It's not just foreign hackers; it's domestic hackers, and it's also not just hackers. It's people who might try to gain physical access to voting machines and interfere. We certainly saw people who were working, to help get Trump elected or to try to subvert the election in 2020, trying to gain physical access to machines. We've seen people who claim to be affiliated with Trump trying to gain access to machines in Colorado this year. And these are all the kinds of security questions that CISA deals with. So there are all these vulnerabilities. And at the same time, even as he cuts funding for real security, he is installing election deniers in important quote unquote election integrity positions in the Department of Homeland Security, where we don't know how they might interfere with the system or how they might simply claim the system is rigged. And we remember in 2020, Trump said he wanted the Justice Department simply to declare that the election was rigged or it was unfair and let him and Republican congressmen take care of it. We can imagine him setting up to do exactly the same thing once again.
But he's also got some of these wacky lawyers that he had last time around. Cleta Mitchell, who was involved in Stop the Steal, she's saying that the chief executive is limited in his role with regard to elections, except if there's a threat to the national sovereignty of the United States. Now, she happens to be wrong there, but she makes this case that maybe Iranian hackers could change the voting results. So there again, it seems like they're almost telling the quiet part out loud.
Right. You both court vulnerability and then you use that vulnerability as an excuse for seizing more power.
So, just in the last minute, then, David, what can our listeners do, the citizens of this country, on its almost 250th birthday, in terms of its democracy? It's hanging by a thread.
I think pay attention, know what the threats are, pay attention to local voting rules and officials. And the other thing that all of these experts told me was get out to vote. Make sure you cast your vote. Do it as early as you can. Make sure you're not late on the postmark. Make sure you're there. Stay in line. Because what defeats anti-democratic action fundamentally is democratic action. So people need to make sure their votes are getting in and are counted.
Well, David Graham, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with David Graham, who's a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics and national affairs. He won the Toner Prize for Excellence in National Political Reporting for his coverage of the 2020 presidential election. And before joining The Atlantic, he reported for Newsweek, The Daily Beast, The Wall Street Journal, and The National. His new book is The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America. And his latest article at The Atlantic is The Anti-MAGA Majority Reemerges. And his recent article at The Atlantic, Donald Trump's plan to subvert the midterms, is already underway, is widely circulated to a lot of national attention. We're going to take a brief station break, and Background Briefing's Gen Z reporter Sasha Linden Cohen will be looking into how Zoran Mamdani can deal with the affordability crisis.
Welcome back. I'm Sasha Linden Cohen, and you're listening to Background Briefing with Ian Masters. I'm usually a producer on the show, but today I'm filling in for Ian for another conversation about Zoran Mamdani's historic victory in the New York City mayoral race. We talked about how Mamdani really managed to build a broad coalition and bring in a ton of new voters, and how his victory really challenges conventional wisdom in the Democratic Party about the most effective ways to broaden the base. But today, we're going to dig into the nitty-gritty a little bit more and look at the policies that really carried him through the finish line, how realistic they are, and how they might actually play out. We're joined now by J.W. Mason, a fellow at the Groundwork Collaborative and a professor of economics at John Jay College of the City University of New York. And he has an article at Dissent magazine, What Can Zoran Accomplish? Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So there were a lot of efforts by Mamdani's opponents to make this race about identity politics and experience and all kinds of other things. But his campaign remained pretty laser focused on affordability as the single most important issue affecting New Yorkers. That doesn't mean he backed down from his other positions, but he definitely kept bringing it back to that main message of affordability. And I wanted to start by asking about one of his most popular campaign promises, which is that he will freeze the rent. So that seems like a pretty lofty goal, even if it's just for rent stabilized units, but it generated a lot of energy and excitement. And I'm curious how achievable you think that is, and how do you think it would affect the broader landscape of housing and development in New York City?
So it's not as radical a proposal as it sounds. About half of our units in New York City, about 1 million units out of our 2 million rental units, 1 million, about half the rental housing is rent stabilized, which means the maximum allowable rent is set each year by a body called the Rent Guidelines Board. All of their members are appointed by the mayor. And it's certainly possible for the mayor to appoint members who are committed to a rent freeze. In fact, under Mayor Bill de Blasio, we had 0% increases for rent stabilized apartments 3 times during his administration. So this is not even a particularly new idea.
Mm.
Now, the wrinkle here is that although all the members are appointed by the mayor, they have fixed terms. And, you know, the problem is that Mayor Adams has allowed almost all of the terms of the current Rent Guidelines Board members to expire. And if he appoints new members, then they will serve out the full terms. So we'll see if that happens. It could be that when Mayor Mamdani takes office, he will be able to appoint a majority of members to the Rent Guidelines Board immediately, and then we will have the rents frozen at when they make their next year's determination a year from now. It could be that if some of those members get replaced by Mayor Adams, that it might be a couple of years before he is able to get a majority on that board. But one way or another, this is actually one of the easiest campaign pledges for him to fulfill. And I think, you know, in general, housing in New York City is rent stabilized either if it's a large building that was built before, I think, 1974, or if the developer voluntarily enters the rent stabilization program as a condition of getting some type of public subsidy. In fact, the majority of newly built housing in New York is rent stabilized. It's something I think a lot of people don't realize. About half of our new housing is affordable housing with public subsidies and income restrictions. But again, we're talking about older buildings. The buildings existed for 50 years now. It's already there. And we're talking about buildings where the developer went in with eyes open and knowing that they were going to have limited rent increases. So I think that the idea that this is going to discourage new development of housing, I think is not credible. I don't think it's going to have any effect on the decisions of developers because, again, this is not some new thing he's proposing. This is the landscape of New York housing and has been for many years.
I mean, you made an interesting point in the piece that rent regulation, as you just said, rent regulation and new development don't have to necessarily be at odds, that they can complement each other. You know, New York City has its own idiosyncratic housing history. There's been turmoil among some owners of rent stabilized units, but I guess in a broad sense, how do you think that works? Stoking development, encouraging development, and trying to keep housing costs down.
There are genuine problems here. One problem is that new development that's unsubsidized, and again, most new development in New York is getting some form of public subsidy, but unsubsidized new development, they're looking for high rents, they're looking for high returns, and they're looking for rent increases. If you bend that curve, if you slow the rate of increases in housing costs or even bring down housing costs, that is going to discourage private development. I think that is a fact. But it's not a fact about rent regulation. It's not a fact about freezing the rent. Anything you do that limits rent growth is going to make it less attractive to private developers. And that, I think is why some of these ideas that we're going to just have land use reform and unleash the power of the market are really kind of over optimistic. I mean, I
Mm.
support land use reform, but I think that the idea that you're going to get this huge surge of new development that's going to significantly slow rent growth is really not taking into account the fact that if you had significantly slower rent growth, a lot of private projects would no longer be attractive to investors. And that's why I think a critical piece of the puzzle here is for the city to come in as an investor, either as a lender or as an equity investor, because the city can accept lower returns than private developers are going to be willing to.
Mm. And does that require the cooperation of the state?
No, I don't think so, actually. I mean, everything to some degree requires the cooperation of the state, but I think less so than in other areas because I think it's very natural to do housing development using debt finance. I think that's, it's the way the private sector does it, and the
Hmm.
public sector can borrow more cheaply than private developers can, and can accept lower returns than private developers can. And the city has a lot under the law. The city has a good deal of unused borrowing capacity. The amount that state law allows the city to issue in terms of general obligation bonds, we're well below that ceiling. So there's a lot of space, and you want to be smart about this. You've got to be careful. You've got to do it in a way that's going to make sense down the road. But there is a lot of space for the city to come in, issue bonds at 4.5% or whatever. That's about what the city currently borrows at, and invest that in new housing that can pay back those bonds while still charging significantly less than market rate housing would charge. And there's various models, but that's the basic picture. I think if we're talking about free childcare, let's say, or we're talking about free buses, or obviously if we're talking about raising the city minimum wage, those are things you really are going to need
Yeah.
state cooperation on. But I think the housing piece actually is somewhat less so.
I wanted to ask about the free buses campaign. That was another one of his big campaign promises that he wants to make buses fast and free. That's been the subject of a lot of debate for policy wonks. And I wanted to just ask if you could tell me about some of the concerns that even progressives have about this proposal, arguing that we really need to focus on making them fast before making them free. But I think he seems to propose them as an idea that goes hand in hand. And I wonder, for you as an economist, does it strike you as a pie in the sky idea, or is that logic kind of a failure of imagination by the old guard?
Well, look, it's definitely not a pie in the sky idea. There's actually a lot of free bus systems in the world. The Bangalore in India, where I happen to spend a certain amount of time, buses, interestingly, are free there for women. It's sort of a gender equity thing. A little city state of Luxembourg in Europe, number of cities in Europe, Kansas City, Albuquerque, Tucson, Richmond, Virginia. These are not like socialist, enclaves, and they all have free bus systems. There's no city the size of New York that currently has a free bus system, but lots of cities have experimented with partially free bus systems. And again, lots of medium-sized cities around the world do have free bus systems. And here in New York, one of the things that Mamdani did when he was a member of the state legislature was put forward a bill that would have a pilot program that would make one bus line in each of the city's 5 boroughs free. And this got enthusiastic support in the legislature. It passed with large majorities in both houses. And, the results have been honestly quite encouraging if you're looking at things like how many additional riders these bus lines get, which is, about a third more, which is a pretty substantial increase. And as far as we can tell, it's not mainly drawing people away from other parts of the transit system. So, if you're doing a pilot program and the pilot's successful, you might say, well, it's time for us to go full scale. That's sort of how pilots work. So I think, again, it's not that radical an idea. I think the concern people have about it is essentially that the biggest issue with buses is speed and reliability. And, you really want to address that. And maybe in an ideal world, if you had $500 million to spend on the buses, you would focus on investments that would be directly focused on speed and reliability rather than, replacing fare box revenue. And I think sort of in the abstract, there's some truth to that, but I think that that's not the world we live in. Nobody is writing, the city a $500 million check and saying, spend this on buses however you think best.
Mm.
The way you get that money is by having a proposal and a campaign that excites people, that you can get political support for, that energizes people, and that you can actually deliver on and get that political payoff that comes from making a big promise and delivering on it. And I think if you say, well, we're going to do, all these street redesigns, and we're going to have this long-term study of how we can synchronize traffic lights better to keep buses moving, and stuff you ought to do, but it doesn't have that. It doesn't energize people in the same way. It doesn't give you something where you can say, I promised, I delivered. And so it doesn't build power for the next stage. So I think there's actually a sort of political logic that says start with free buses.
Yeah, a sort of a slogan that really like hits home. Um,
That's right.
I was gonna ask, it strikes me that the campaign seems to have effectively redefined affordability in a lot of ways, making a city more affordable isn't just about lower prices, but it's about expanding public services is sort of the pitch that he's putting forward. And As you write in your piece, city government hasn't historically or typically been the best platform for expanding the public sector. But I guess, do you think that shift in framing, like really the campaign energy and the campaign messaging, and sort of how that might trickle into city government and state government, could actually practically affect change in terms of what is possible for expanding those
Absolutely.
public services?
Absolutely. No, I think one of the things that was really brilliant about this campaign is that it took this message of affordability that really does resonate with people, especially after the experience of high inflation, in 2021, 22. Um, but it transformed the meaning of it because I think there was this idea, oh, inflation is always an issue that helps the right. It means we're spending too much money. It means wages are too high. It means we have to cut back. And the idea here is no affordability. We have an affordability crisis because specific prices are too high. It's not just the economy, it's not just wages, it's not just too much money, it's specific prices. And as government, what are you going to do? What are you going to say? Is there some shortage? Is there some bottleneck that we can address here? Like, why aren't we building enough housing? Or are there, companies with monopoly power that we have to challenge? Or is this just not a service that the private sector can provide at a reasonable price, which might be the case with childcare? So we're going to ask, what are the positive affirmative things government can do to actually lower the cost of living for people? And I think just reframing affordability in that way is what made this campaign so powerful.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about another thing you brought up in your piece, which is that many of these central campaign platforms surrounding affordability, lower housing costs, better transit, universal childcare, they aren't actually that different from a lot of Democratic platforms. Why do you think they're making such a splash, framing him as a radical when, most Democrats include and incorporate affordability policies into their messaging too?
Well, I think there's several differences. One is there's a difference between saying this is a problem we want to address at some point gradually. We want to move towards it. We're going to have something that's targeted and means tested and limited, um, versus saying this is just a thing we are going to do. We aren't going to say, let's try to have a commission to think about how we can have lower rent increases. No, we're going to freeze the rent. We don't say, oh, let's give out some vouchers, to help people defray childcare costs. No, free childcare for everyone. So first of all, it's framing these things that, as you say, are in some ways broadly held democratic goals, but saying, no, this we're not just going to do a little bit at a time. We're going to do it for real now in one big step. So that's one. Two is, of course, that somebody's got to pay for it, and that's really the sticking point. Because I think a lot of people, certainly in New York State, in the Democratic establishment, would say, sure, yes, in principle, absolutely, we should have free universal childcare. But if you say, well, let's raise taxes on the millionaires and billionaires to pay for it, that's a harder sell. So I think too, I think there's a funny thing here where in some sense the socialists and the radicals are the realistic ones. I think there's a certain number of moderate liberals who have this sort of fantasy that you can do big things without paying a big price for it. And the socialists are the ones saying, no, we want to do the big things and we're willing to pay the big price tag of doing them. And that, the other thing, of course, is that this is a campaign that has energized a huge swath of the city, young people, immigrants like the South Asian community, Muslims behind him. And honestly, I think that's very threatening to a lot of the establishment. And I think in particular, his clear position about in support of Gaza and solidarity with Palestine and acknowledging the genocide being carried out by Israel in Gaza is something that really separates him from the establishment. And on the one hand, it obviously has generated a lot of hatred and fear from some parts of the establishment, but I think it also really legitimates him in people's eyes that this is somebody who's actually telling the truth about what we can all see with our own eyes instead of trying to kind of play games and conceal it. And I think that's been very powerful, but it is also very threatening to some people.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about how much money was funneled into the Cuomo campaign by millionaires and billionaires and people really trying to prevent Mamdani from getting into to office. And he pointed out several times that the amount of money that was spent trying to prevent him from getting into office was probably more than he would have taxed them. So there's just this kind of irony there, I guess, of
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. And there's another piece of that. If you're talking about Bill Ackman, or especially, let's say, if we're talking about the editorial board of New York Times and people they talk to, which is he's not part of the club. These people are used to, if they want something done from city government, to know who to call up. If they want to get a job for their young, their kid or their relative or their protege, they know who to call up. They're used to feeling like the government answers to them. And Zoran is an outsider. There was a funny moment, back when Andrew Cuomo was governor, towards the end of the time that he was governor, when they were scrambling to figure out how to deal with all these, sexual harassment accusations that were being made so credibly against him, and some of the internal communications, the text messages among his team, were released by the state attorney general's office as part of the investigation. And at one point, Melissa DeRosa and Liz Smith and some of his other cronies are going through a list of legislators to see who they can kind of get back over on their side, and they get to Mamdani, and they say, "Oh, Zoran, he's a socialist. He's from DSA. We've got nothing on him. We've got no play there."
Mm.
And it was such a perfect moment, and I think that's how a lot of these people feel. We've got no play with him. We're used to having a government that answers to us, and he doesn't. So it's not even what he's going to do. It's just that he's not answerable to the people who are used to being in charge.
Hmm. Absolutely. Just in closing, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, I guess, the nationwide context of this victory. I'm thinking of other cities who have elected progressive leaders over the past few years. I'm thinking about Lori Lightfoot in Chicago, who ran.
And Brandon Johnson more is
Brandon Johnson more
to be example.
recently. No, I know. Well, I'm curious about, I guess, Lori Lightfoot. She ran on a progressive platform, and her tenure
Yeah.
was kind of a spectacular failure.
Yes.
And then Michelle Wu, who became mayor of Boston in 2021,
More
who's
encouraging, yes.
been more encouraging. Yeah, she was reelected this week. She seems to have delivered on a lot of her progressive promises. And obviously, all of these are very different cities, but I wonder if there are any lessons that Mamdani can heed from these examples. I mean, thinking economically, but also just sort of leadership wise, in your
Well,
opinion.
leaving Michelle Wu aside, something that Zoran Mamdani and Brandon Johnson have in common that Lori Lightfoot did not have is they come out of a real mass organization. They have a real base. And I think that's, one of the most important things about Zoran Mamdani is he comes out of DSA, the Democratic
Hmm.
Socialists of America. That's who organized his campaign. That's who set up these giant canvases with 90,000 volunteers knocking on doors. That's who recruited him to run in the first place for state assembly. And that is a base that is not going away. That's a movement that is going to be there to support him and back him up in any sort of conflict he has with the city council or the state legislature. And that's something that somebody like Lori Lightfoot just absolutely did not have. And I think that may be really a critical difference that allows him to be successful where she was not.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate talking with you.
Great. Well, thank you.
Again, we've been speaking with J.W. Mason, a fellow at the Groundwork Collaborative and a professor of economics at John Jay College of the City University of New York, where his research focuses on macroeconomics, finance, economic history, the history of economic thought, and international finance and trade. He was previously the policy director for New York State Working Families Party, and he has a recent article at Dissent magazine, What Can Zoran Accomplish?
And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Sasha Linden Cohen, and Asher Price. If you missed any of today's program or would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on those platforms. Find us on Twitter and Facebook, as well as also now on Blue Sky at Ian Masters Media. And please do help us reach more listeners by sharing the program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help us sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing, and I'm always available at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
The guy that lived next door in 305 and answered in America. People having so much faith, die too soon, well, all the rest are made. We write a song that no one sings on a cold black stone where a lasting peace will finally break. Sunlight plays upon my window pane. I wake up to a world that's still the same. My father said to be strong, that a good man can never do wrong. In a dream I had last night in America, a wise man was telling stories to me about the places he had been to and the things that he had seen. A quiet voice was singing something to me, an angel song about the home of the brave in this land here of the free. One time, one night in America. Time, one night in America.